Okie dokie. So here we go. We're going to talk about Tommy J's presidency. Um, for being such a smart, capable person, it really doesn't go all that well. He has one bright, shining moment in his presidency, and then after that, it's not good. And even the bright, shining moment is like could have been unconstitutional. We don't know. So away we go. Tommy J's presidency, the wannabe Federalist. Remember, Thomas Jefferson was an anti Federalist. He was against all these Federalist ideas, a strong federal government, that the national bank, manufacturing. He was against all of these Federalist ideas that Alexander Hamilton was in favor of. And then when Tommy J becomes president, things change, maybe. All right, so here we go. So Thomas Jefferson had always said he wants a small government, a very, very small government that really doesn't do anything other than maybe foreign policy, foreign relations, and take care of the military. And he wanted a country of small, what he called yeoman farmers, just these small farmers who have small plots of land, who are basically just growing enough food for themselves and then maybe a little bit of food to be sent out to market. But he wanted a bunch of just self-sufficient, very small farmers. He doesn't envision a country of large farmers. He doesn't envision a country of large cities. Just very small, basic, simple farmers. That's what he wants. And that's what he advocates all the way up to his presidency. When he becomes president, almost everything he does is the exact opposite of what he believes. First off, he increases the tariff. Now, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. So this is a tax coming of stuff coming into the United States from other countries, mostly Europe. And he sets the tariff at 30%, so a 30% tax on imported goods. Well, of course, companies, when they get taxed, they pass that tax along to consumers. So prices of goods skyrocket. Thomas Jefferson said he did this to protect American industries, to help the American economy. However, the problem is we don't really have any industry at this point. There's nothing to protect. Everything that we're getting that's manufactured pretty much is coming from Europe at this point. So now, because of this tariff, prices are so high in the United States that people can't afford to buy things. The economy begins to slowly begin to go down because of this. Now, people in Thomas Jefferson's party plead with him to lower the tariff. Thomas Jefferson refuses. And then we come to the Bank of the United States. Remember, this was a huge fight between Jefferson and Hamilton. Hamilton desperately wanted it. Hamilton believed that this was key for the well-being and the future of this nation. Jefferson was against it. Now that Thomas Jefferson's president, his political party, the Jeffersonians or the Democratic Republicans, are putting pressure on Tommy J to end the bank, to just close it down. And remember the reasons why they want this. Okay? They believe that the bank is unconstitutional. They believe that the bank gives the government too much power over the economy. And they think this is just a bad thing for the United States, that it goes against the basic fundamentals of liberty and everything that the country was founded on. Thomas Jefferson refuses to get rid of the bank. At one time, Thomas Jefferson was dead set against a bank even being created, and now he says, no, we're going to keep it. Reason why Thomas Jefferson cites the elastic clause. Remember, this is what Alexander Hamilton argued. Just because it isn't in the Constitution doesn't mean that the United States can't have it, right? That this is a needed power given to the government by the Constitution, even though it's not explicitly said. Thomas Jefferson probably still didn't like the idea of the bank, but he now understands the reason for the bank, and he refuses to get rid of it. The next big issue that seems to go against Thomas Jefferson's political beliefs would be voting. Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, had long been advocating for an expansion of the vote, right? Right now, the only people that can vote are land-owning men, essentially wealthy white men, the only ones that could vote. And the Democratic Republicans argue that if we are to be a democracy, if we are to be a government of the people, we should increase the number of people who are eligible to vote. However, Thomas Jefferson says no. Thomas Jefferson believes that there are just too many uneducated people out there, that there are just not enough people who understand the need for government and how government operates. And he believes that if you give uneducated people the right to vote, they're going to do crazy things with their ballot. And they would vote for very bad causes or very bad people, and it would end up causing very serious, irreparable damage to the country. So Thomas Jefferson refuses to expand the vote. He maintains that only land-owning men should be allowed to vote because they're educated and they know what needs to be done because they don't want to lose their property. Sounds a lot like Alexander Hamilton. I don't know. And now, our bright shining moment in the Jefferson presidency. So when Jefferson becomes president, he has a problem. He can't get off the Mississippi River onto the Gulf of Mexico. If you remember, a treaty that was done under Washington it was a treaty with Spain that allowed the United States access to the Gulf of Mexico through New Orleans. So we could get goods on and off of the Mississippi River. Well, in the meantime, France has come back, has taken back the Louisiana Territory from Spain. Napoleon, right? You guys know Napoleon in France. Napoleon basically goes to Spain and tells Spain, I want the Louisiana Territory back, and if you don't give it to me, I'm going to take out Spain. So Spain gives the Louisiana Territory back to France to keep Napoleon from taking them over. So now France, once again, has control of the Louisiana Territory. And in doing so, they shut off access through New Orleans onto the Gulf of Mexico from the Mississippi River. And this is causing all sorts of problems for the United States in trade. So Thomas Jefferson wants to buy just a little teeny tiny part of land in New Orleans that would allow the United States on and off the Mississippi River and onto the Gulf of Mexico. And Thomas Jefferson goes to Congress, presents this idea of buying a little tiny piece of land in New Orleans so that we could get on and off the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico. And Congress agrees. Congress agrees to give Thomas Jefferson $10 million to Napoleon in exchange for this little tiny piece of land in New Orleans. So Thomas Jefferson gets the $10 million and he sends off some representatives, some diplomats to France to talk with Napoleon about paying Napoleon $10 million for this tiny piece of land. It's about a square mile of land that they wanted. In the meantime, that it takes the diplomats to get from the United States to France, some things have changed for France. In the Caribbean, France has a colony, Haiti, and Haiti has had a slave revolt. The slaves in Haiti rose up against the French government and overthrew the French government. So France no longer has Haiti. Now, Napoleon, one of the reasons why he wanted the Louisiana Purchase, because Napoleon's plan was, once he conquered Europe, he was then going to use Haiti as a launching point to take over the United States. And so he wanted the Louisiana Purchase. He wanted that Louisiana Territory for that purpose of eventually attacking the United States. However, they've now lost Haiti. They do not have Haiti as a colony, so he doesn't have that foothold in the Western Hemisphere any longer. On top of that, the war in Europe that Napoleon is fighting against pretty much everybody is not going well for Napoleon. It's taken a turn against the French, and Napoleon is in desperate, desperate need for money. He really needs money to fund this war. So when the American diplomats show up, they sit down with Napoleon and they tell him, we've got $10 million and we want to buy a little tiny piece of land in New Orleans so we can get ships on and off the Gulf of Mexico and onto the Mississippi River. Well, Napoleon needs money. Napoleon has lost his colony in the Caribbean, the Haitian colony, so he no longer has a launching point for an invasion of the United States. So he really doesn't have any need for the Louisiana Territory anymore. Napoleon gives them a counteroffer that absolutely stuns the diplomats. Napoleon tells the Americans, I will do better than that. If you give me $15 million, I will let you have that little piece of land in New Orleans, and I'll throw the rest of the Louisiana Territory in for free. Oh, this is crazy, right? This is insane. The United States went there with $10 million for about a square mile of land. And Napoleon, who is now desperate for money and no longer needs the Louisiana Territory, offers the entire territory for $5 million more. This works out to 5 cents an acre that Napoleon is proposing to sell to the United States. Well, the American diplomats are stunned. They have no clue what to say. And they tell Napoleon, we'll be right back. We got to go make a phone call. Yeah, they don't make a phone call, right? There's no phones back then. So they have to send a letter back to the United States and tell Jefferson what's happening. Big problem when Jefferson gets this letter. Congress is out of session. Congress has gone on a break. They've all gone home. Jefferson could recall an emergency session of Congress, but that'll take weeks, if not months, for that Congress to reconvene because they've got to come from all over the country. And again, they're coming by horseback or they're coming by carriage, right? It's a long process to get from Kentucky to Washington, D.C. So Jefferson, he's in a rock and a hard place because only Congress can authorize the spending of money, right? The president can ask for it, but only Congress can say yay or nay. Congress told Jefferson he could spend $10 million, not 15. So Thomas Jefferson is going to take a chance here. Thomas Jefferson is going to authorize this purchase for $15 million without congressional approval. This is technically unconstitutional. Jefferson could be impeached for overstepping his authority as president. It doesn't happen, of course. Once Congress finds out what we bought, that we've doubled the size of the United States for $5 million more than what they were originally planning on spending, they're very happy with this. They're ecstatic with what has happened. So that happens the first term of Jefferson's presidency. Brings us to 1804, which is an election year. And Thomas Jefferson, on the strength of the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the country, wins re-election. So now we got to figure out what's out there, right? Nobody's ever really gone out there and explored. No European, no American really knows what's out there. So we want to go find out what's there. So Thomas Jefferson appoints two men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, to explore this new territory. And Jefferson really wants to believe that we can find a Northwest Passage. What? The Northwest Passage, remember the Northwest Passage? That's what they were looking for in the early days of exploration when the New World was founded. There was this belief that there was a waterway that went across this landmass from the Atlantic to the Pacific, right? Now that was 200 years ago, 150 years ago. This is 1804. And Jefferson still believes that there's a Northwest Passage. Jefferson is the smartest, most intelligent, most educated person maybe in the Western Hemisphere. And he believes that there's a Northwest Passage? Come on, Tommy J. Right? There's a basic law of physics at work here. There can't be this Northwest Passage because water can't go uphill. And we know by 1804 that there's like a big giant mountain range right in the middle of the country called the Rocky Mountains. But somehow, some way, Thomas Jefferson believed that there was still the Northwest Passage. I don't know. Thomas Jefferson also sends Lewis and Clark out there to explore the area for settlement. Let's find places we can begin to expand and have people move out there, settlers move out there and begin to tame the land. And he also wants them to make peace with the Native Americans, which we knew there were a lot of there. We got to make peace with them so that it's easier and safer for settlers to move out there. So Lewis and Clark launched their expedition from St. Louis, right, which was the furthest west settlement. It was just a little tiny dusty tent colony, really pretty much at that time. But that's where they launched their expedition from, into the Louisiana Territory. And this is why St. Louis is known as the Gateway of the West, because this was where they launched the investigation into the West, into the frontier at that time. And this is why the arch is in St. Louis, right? That's the gateway into the West. Now, along the way, they find this young Native American woman, a woman by the name of Sacagawea. And Sacagawea agrees to go along with them to help them navigate. She says she knows the land fairly well. She can help them get to where they're going. And she speaks several different Native languages, so she can help them connect with the Native Americans. Now, this is a crazy story, y'all. Check this out. Sacagawea is a young lady. She's married to a French fur trapper who happens to live within the tribe with Sacagawea and her tribe. And Sacagawea has a young baby. Lewis and Clark happen to stumble into their camp one day and they start talking. And somehow, some way, they ask Sacagawea to help them. And Sacagawea says, "Oh, sure." What? Like, she goes and tells her French husband, "Oh, hey, I'm going to leave for a couple of months, maybe a year, and I'm going to go off into the wilderness with these two guys and all of their male friends. And we're just going to go off and I'm going to show them, how to get to where they're going. I'll be home. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. I'll be home in a couple of months, maybe a year." And her husband apparently says, "Dokie dokie." I don't know. I don't know. Apparently that worked. I don't know how, but somehow it did. Now, along the way, Lewis and Clark keep a lot of journal. They write meticulously and religiously in this journal. And they write about the weather. They describe the vegetation. They talk about the landforms. They talk about the animals that they come in contact with. The first European contact that we know of with a grizzly bear happens during this expedition. Clark is down at a river one morning, kind of, throwing water on his face, kind of cleaning himself up. And he hears some splashing around across the river. And he looks across the river and he sees this gigantic bear, the grizzly bear, splashing around in there. And at first, Lewis thinks it's a monster, right? Because they've never seen anything that large. They also continue to send specimens back to Thomas Jefferson. They box up plants and rocks and things that they find, and they send it back to Jefferson. They have a courier, somebody who's traveling with them, who runs these shipments back to St. Louis, and then they're shipped to Washington, D.C. Now, one of the things that they shipped back to Jefferson was an elk. Along the way, they killed an elk. And certainly, Europe has elk, but they don't have elk that are big. They don't have North American elk. North American elk are huge compared to European. So they kill this elk and they eat it, but they chop the head off. And then they send the head back to Jefferson. And Jefferson is ecstatic when he gets this elk head. Now, can you imagine what this is like? Like delivering this? You have this rotting elk head, and I'm sure it stunk and it's just all gooey and ugh. But Jefferson thought it was the greatest thing in the world because Jefferson always was interested in proving that the beauty and the majesty and the greatness of America was better than that of Europe. And this, in Jefferson's mind, proved that. Our animals are significantly larger than European animals. But, when Jefferson opens this up, there's stories that, the White House was stunk up with the smell of this rotting elk head. Ugh, I don't know. They also send back dinosaur bones to Jefferson that they kind of find along the way. So Thomas Jefferson is just enthralled by these things that they're finding. In 1805, November of 1805, Lewis and Clark finally reached their destination, the Pacific Ocean, in present-day Astoria, Oregon. That's where they end their investigation. They finally reached the ocean. And they've crossed the country now. From sea to shining sea, they've crossed the country. They never find the Northwest Passage because it doesn't exist. But they've now opened up the West, and they've explored it, and they've made some trails, and they've made some maps to make it easier for people to come out. Now, here's the amazing thing. On this entire expedition, which was enormously dangerous and I'm sure scary at times, only one person dies during the expedition. And they died from appendicitis. Their appendix broke, busted open, and it killed them. And that's the only person that died. They had people break their legs and things like that, but nobody died. It was amazing, amazing story. Then things go bad again for Jefferson. Surprise! France and England are at war again. And Thomas Jefferson desperately wants to stay out of this, right? He knows that the United States can't get involved in a European conflict, right? We can't afford it. We don't have the army, and it would just be disastrous. And then in February of 1806, France blockades England, trying to choke England out. So what does England do? They blockade France. And this is really bad for the United States because we've lost our two most important trading partners in the world, France and England. So Thomas Jefferson, desperate to figure out a way to open up trade routes again, comes up with some very bizarre plans. I mean, he tries to figure this out, but bless his heart, it just doesn't work out, right? And they're just very weird. First, he comes up with the Embargo Act of 1806. Thomas Jefferson announces the United States is not going to trade with either England or France until one lifts the blockade of the other. We're already not trading with them because of the blockade. What does this do? Exactly nothing. So Thomas Jefferson then comes up with an even more bizarre plan. The Embargo Act of 1807. The United States announces that it won't trade with the entire world until either England or France lift a blockade. Thomas Jefferson hopes that by cutting off trade with the entire world, that the world will put pressure on England and France to end the blockade and, reopen trade. Well, the problem is all of our trade is primarily with England and France. We don't have a lot of trade with the rest of the world. So nobody notices and nobody cares. So now we're not trading with anybody. And the American economy absolutely craters at this point. There's accounts of just stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of cargo, mostly food products, sitting on the docks in Charleston and in Boston and in New York City. And they're just rotting and flies and the smell because there's nowhere to ship these. The economy just craters and the United States goes into an economic depression. Which brings us to 1808, which is an election year. Thomas Jefferson announces, you know, Washington ran twice, and that was good enough. If it was good enough for Washington, it's good enough for me. And Tommy J says he will not run for a third term, which probably worked out well because he probably would not have won anyways. He was not very popular at this point. So his last act is another very weird one. It's called the Non-Intercourse Act. Here's what it does. Basically, it repeals the embargo of 1807. The United States will now trade with the world, but it's still not going to trade with England and France. And again, nothing really happened because we didn't really trade with a whole lot of people after this. And the people that we did trade with, the few people we did trade with, had kind of moved on and found other trading partners to get what they needed. So, I don't know. So Thomas Jefferson leaves the presidency a battered, bruised president, right? Not a lot goes well for him other than the Louisiana Purchase. And he goes home to Monticello, where he founds the University of Virginia. He actually draws up the blueprints and he buys the property and he starts the University of Monticello or University of Virginia. He is, however, massively, massively, massively in debt. Thomas Jefferson never had any money. He had lots of land and he had this beautiful home Monticello, but he never really had any money, right? He loved to spend money. If he had $5, he was going to spend 7. So he's always in debt. His main passions for spending money is French wine. He loves himself some French wine and books. Loves books. So to help him get out of debt, Thomas Jefferson comes to Congress after he's president and he appeals to Congress. I'm terribly in debt and I want to try to get out of debt and pay off my bills. I'm a U.S. president. Can you help me out? And so Congress agrees. So here's what they do. Thomas Jefferson donates his collection of books twice to the United States, and these become the foundation of the Library of Congress, right? He sells off his entire book collection to Congress to start this library. And then instead of taking that money that he got from selling his books to Congress, he uses it to buy more books, and he has to do it a second time. I don't know. So Thomas Jefferson, then I told you guys the story about him dying on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, same day as John Adams. On Thomas Jefferson's headstone, if you go to Monticello and you see where he's buried, on his headstone it lists his accomplishments. Missing from his accomplishments, and Thomas Jefferson, I should point out, wrote his own epitaph that was going to be written on his headstone. He wrote out what he wanted. Missing from it is his time as governor of Virginia during the Revolutionary War. That didn't go well. And president of the United States. He writes out author of the Declaration of Independence, the French ambassador, Secretary of State, but he does not list being the wartime governor of Virginia or the president of the United States because it just didn't go well for him. All right, so election, 1808. James Madison, father of the Constitution, Tommy J, Secretary of State, is elected president in a landslide victory over the Federalist candidate Charles Pinckney. Now, Madison is the 4th president of the United States. He's the 3rd Virginian to be elected to office. That leads to, and he inherits an embargo mess. We'll talk about what the Virginia thing was here in a little bit. He inherits this huge mess right? He's got this embargo mess that Jefferson has created. So Madison tries to figure it out. Here's what he does. In 1809, there's a bill called Macon's Bill, number 2. What Macon Bill number 1 is, it doesn't matter. And frankly, I don't know what Bacon's Bill number 1 was. Number 2 is the important one. Here's what it does. It sets up a competition, a race between England and France. The bill states, whichever nation lifts its blockade of the other nation first, the United States would trade exclusively, only with that nation. So if England lifts its blockade of France first, the United States will only trade with England and vice versa. So it sets up this race between the two countries. All right, so Napoleon, who is desperate at this point. Napoleon, his people are starving, his economy is terrible. Napoleon desperately needs help. So he immediately takes the United States up on this and lifts the French blockade of England. And American ships begin immediately heading towards French port. Problem is, there's still English Navy out there. The English are furious with the United States over this. So England begins intercepting these cargo ships on their way to France and taking them over. Essentially, they're pirates, and they're taking these ships and they're taking the cargo. And then they do what's called impressing the sailors. And it's not like, hey, look how tough and how good we are. We're really smart, right? No. That's not impressing. Impressing means that they take the American sailors from these ships and they force them to serve in the English Navy. They impress them into the English Navy. Essentially, they're slaves in the English Navy. And this goes on for 2 years into Madison's presidency. And the Americans, during this time, Americans just get angrier and angrier and angrier that England is doing this to American ships and, more importantly, to American sailors. So, the Americans just get angrier and angrier during this time. Eventually, the drumbeat for war begins to get louder and louder in the country. More and more people want to go to war with England because of the impressment and the plundering of American ships on the high seas. So Madison is in a tough spot here, right? Very tough spot. Because we don't have an army. We have a really small navy that certainly cannot take on the likes of which, England has. We don't have a lot of money. We're still a pretty weak, insignificant country. And England is the most powerful nation the world had ever known. England was the big dog on the block, and we could not stand up to England. It was impossible. On top of that, England is still going around telling people that England and the United States are still a thing, that they're just kind of taking a break, and England desperately wants the United States back to be a part of England. On top of all this is 1812, which is an election year. So Madison has a real dilemma here. If he doesn't go to war, if Madison doesn't say, yes, let's go to war, he may lose the presidency. He may be voted out of office because people around the country are so angry at the English that they desperately want to go to war. However, this is the problem. If he declares war on England, the United States will probably lose. It was only in a miracle and a grace of God that the United States beat England in the Revolutionary War. And we didn't beat them. Remember, England just kind of quit, right? We were lucky that time. If we go to war with England again, we're probably not going to be that lucky. And we're going to lose, and it will be the end of the United States. However, if he doesn't declare war, he'll probably not be reelected. And somebody else will come in as president, and they'll declare war, and that'll be the end of the country. Oof. So what to do here? And you thought figuring out where to go to dinner for homecoming, like when homecoming was a thing, before we had the Rona running around, you thought that was hard. This guy's got a real hard choice. So, really quick, the War of 1812 is pretty interesting. Not a lot happens, but it's a really interesting war. But unfortunately, we just don't have the time to go over it. So, really quick, let me tell you what happens. James Madison chooses to declare war on England. He is reelected president. England does come over to the United States. There are a series of battles. Eventually, England pretty much just gets tired of continuous war in Europe, and they're just worn out of war. So England just decides in 1816 they're done, or 1815 they decide they're done, and they finish the war, and they ask the United States for a peace treaty. The United States agrees. We sign a peace treaty with England, ending the war in 1815. And the outcome of the war is England really didn't lose anything. We didn't really gain anything. Things just remained the way they were. But the important thing is, for the second time in less than 50 years, we took on the strongest nation the world had ever known. And for the second time, we survived. And this is at the end of the War of 1812, maybe the most significant thing coming out of the War of 1812 is that for the first time, there is this feeling of patriotism in the country. For the first time, people really begin to feel like maybe this is going to work. People were no longer living in fear, like, well, we'll just be here until somebody from Europe shows up and takes us over. For the first time, people really begin to feel this sense of nationalism, this sense of patriotism. And for the first time in a long time, or the first time really in ever, people begin to refer themselves as Americans, as a separate entity. 4th of July becomes a big holiday after this. It becomes a national holiday. It had never really been celebrated until after the War of 1812. So you get this surge of nationalism, this surge of national identity. And maybe that's the biggest thing coming out of it. All right, we're done with Madison and Jefferson. I'm sorry we didn't have time for the War of 1812. I got some really good stories, national anthem and all that comes out of it. But unfortunately, the age of Rona, we just don't have the time. All right, until next time, Panthers, talk to you later.